Good day, ladies and gents, and welcome to this special Anzac Day stream, which I was actually asked to do. Nice to see Jobu in the show. Um, yeah, could I just say, as far as I'm concerned, this is kind of a Lady Echelot stream. Lady Echelot is a great lady from Northern Ireland originally, who has lived in Australia for a long time, uh, has an Australian husband, several children, and she's one of the last great ladies. And sadly, she's not very well at the moment, and she's in hospital. So, as far as I'm concerned, we should all wish her well. And if we're Christians, send her our prayers. So there we go. I have various guests who are going to join me this evening at various times. Don't know how long it will take for them to join me, but we shall see. In the meantime, I'm going to spend half my time waiting for my extremely slow computer to do anything, basically. I mean, it's like I sit here and the computer makes tiny little circles and doesn't do anything. So, there we go. But we will get there. What can I say about Anzac Day? I don't know. I have no idea in what direction this stream will go. Might be historical, might be more political. I would say, in terms of the historical stuff, of which I can claim to be fairly knowledgeable, I guess. In World War II, the first Allied nation to beat the Germans on land at Tobruk were mostly Australians. The first Allied nation to beat the Japanese on land in New Guinea, which in those days was mostly an Australian colony, once again were Australians. And indeed, some of those gentlemen were the same people. I would also think that if those old diggers from World War II could see Australia today, they would probably be rolling in their graves for the most part, because Worms, I sent you one on Twitter, but I'll send you another one on Discord, mate, just now, as soon as my Discord link opens again. But yeah, but you do have a link on Twitter, mate. But yeah, I think most of those old World War II diggers, if they could see Australia today, would be like rolling in their grave, quite honestly. Worms, if you look on Twitter in your direct messages, you'll find you have a link. But whatever. All right, then. Let's see how that goes. Bum, bum, bum. All right, let me try this again. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. No, I see. Sorry, mate. The message didn't go through. Okay. Sorry, gentlemen. We'll get this sorted in a second. Wow. I can't imagine. Hmm. Hmm. I'm sorry, gents and ladies in the chat. I'm sending the links out again, which the first time didn't work. I'm not quite sure what it is, but anyway. I think it did that time. There you go. It did that time. There you go.
Hello, Iron Duke.
How you going, Tim? I'm so sorry, mate. The first time I sent you the link on Twitter,
Hello,
it didn't work.
Iron
So
Duke.
forgive me. How you going, Tim?
I'm going well. Yeah, you sent me the YouTube link, but not the StreamYard link. So
Yeah, I'm sorry, it didn't work the first time, mate. Apparently, Marcus Furious will join us in a bit. Not quite now because he's on his way home at the moment.
I caught the beginning of your reflection, remembrance, and that's certainly not what our leaders, who they're the ones who basically make their presence known on Anzac Day. They just talk about the diggers and the sacrifice for our freedoms while they strip them away at record speed. But certainly, as you were saying, that the diggers who fought in World War One, World War Two, I mean, there's no time machine where, well, freezing, you can't freeze people or resurrect people. Only that's only happened on one occasion. But if they could see today what Australia and all the Western nations have become, what would they think?
I think they'd be very, very sad, Tim. I think they would wonder what they fought for. I think they'd be very disappointed. You know, they were famous for being very good soldiers, but also maybe not always guys who would fall into line, you know. Particularly in Australia, I think the Australian diggers were known for being guys who could think for themselves. And I think they would wonder what the hell they fought those wars for, to be honest with you, Tim. I don't know what you think, but that's what I think. Anyway.
Well, going back to where the Anzac legend or Anzac Day itself was born, so the World War One Gallipoli campaign, which it was a disaster with so many young Australians just over the trenches to be slaughtered by the Ottoman Turks.
Mm-hmm.
Australia was a young nation at that time. Australia was at war because the empire was at war, and that was the same at the beginning of World War II. Australia declared war on Germany because the empire was at war. But it was these, well, it's, I think, calling war an experience. It leads to thousands and led to thousands of Australians dying, well, millions dying overall. And certainly those experiences, war, it does leave, it does build on the nation. And Australia didn't like a federation in 1901. That didn't Australia didn't basically. We're Australia now. There's the Australian identity. There's an
True.
Australian culture. It grew over time, including in those bruising world wars. And obviously, the big sort of change into the evolution of the Australian identity was also the switch in World War II from, well, we've got to defend Australia, our country, from the Japanese expansion. And John Curtin, who took over from Robert Menzies just before Pearl Harbor, signed the Anzac Treaty. And we should also remember that Anzac, the NZ, New Zealand, it's the only day that Australia and New Zealand share together. And the Anzac Treaty, which Australia and New Zealand signed with the United States, that signified that, well, we're under threat. We need to make a foreign policy which will help us keep the nation together. So that was another evolution there. And the Australianization continued after World War II. Ben Chifley, who took over from John Curtin, who died at the end of the war, passed the Australian Citizenship Act. We didn't have Australian citizenship before 1949, and that came into being. So the pity of war, the bloody experiences of war, it does, and this is also what we remember on Anzac Day, that afterwards the rebuilding and the continued building of Australian identity and culture.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you say there, Tim. I would say, what do you think of Billy Hughes?
Well, certainly he was. We're going to get into this, I think, a lot about. I mean, the line that's repeated is the Anzacs fought for our freedom. Though, even though the young nation of Australia got had heaps of even underage boys volunteering. He was adamant that conscription needed to be introduced. I made dissent against the war illegal. He was a very illiberal prime minister, probably one of the worst that we've had.
He was a Labour prime minister, though, wasn't he?
They eventually parted ways though, and he merged with Billy Hughes merged with the original Commonwealth Liberal Party to form the Nationalist Party.
I would just say that, like, looking at that era, which is World War One rather than World War Two, but looking at that era from a a dissident right perspective, Billy Hughes was very much a empire loyalist. He was also very much against the Washington Naval Treaty with the Americans, which of course reduced the British Navy to the same size as the American Navy when it had originally been much bigger. And also Billy Hughes was very much against ending the Anglo-Japanese naval agreement, for the very good reason that Billy Hughes realized if you ended that, then Japan was going to become an enemy of Australia. So from those points of view, I think things are not perhaps as simple as they sometimes seem. I don't know.
No, exactly, and this is what you and we do our streams and contribute on, obviously, the Twitter X as it is now, and through the Unshackled is have a broader conversation about the complexities of world history, because both the established right and left to use that political that there's only two. Obviously, the leftists basically that all the white Western countries are all bad. I mean, there's some academics who believe that Japan tried to invade Australia because we were so racist, even though they country. And then there's the teachers for Palestine trying to say that we shouldn't have gone, that it was terrible for us to go and assault Turkey. Though we have to remember, it's always talked about that Gallipoli Australians were fighting the Turks. It's not mentioned about the Ottoman Empire, that's which was an Islamic caliphate, and at the same time that they were slaughtering the Anzacs, they were slaughtering the Armenians when the Armenian genocide occurred. But
you're not allowed to talk about that, Tim. I'm pretty sure you'll get banned if you talk about that too much.
Well, coincidentally, 24th of April is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. And the Armenians, even today, they are under constant threat of genocide from their Azerbaijan Islamic neighbors. I mean, that's why there's such a Armenian diaspora in Western nations.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. When I look at World War One for the Australians, I tend to look at things like one of the last great cavalry charges in history, which was the Australians at Beersheba in 1917. Australians tend to focus on Gallipoli when Australia lost many, many brave men, although it has to be said, not a quarter as many as the British did. But if you look at things like Beersheba in 1917, this was one of the last great cavalry charges in history. The casualties were not particularly high, and the Australian Light Horse, who were supposedly mounted infantry, actually mounted one of the last great cavalry charges in the whole wide world. Quite well done, by the way, in a movie called The Light Horseman from the 1970s or 80s. But yeah.
Peter Weir's movie Gallipoli, that obviously is much more well known. Peter Weir, famous Australian director, directed Picnic at Hanging Rock, and also went to Hollywood. The Truman Show was one that he directed as well, and it got shown when we were at school, and it shows that the Anzacs who signed up thought they were going on a great adventure, because this was, I mean, there was no airplanes in those days. It was like it took you 6 months to travel around the world, and obviously it was before the automobile age as well, and so a chance to go on the other side of the world. But then the movie goes into at the trench warfare at Gallipoli, and the reason again, you just mentioned the Battle of Beersheba, which obviously the focus is on Gallipoli because that is April 25 is when there was the dawn landings there on the Gallipoli Peninsula in 1915, which is why we get up at 5 a.m. For dawn services.
Don't disagree at all, Tim. Everything you said, totally agree. Furious, how are you going, mate?
Good, thank you, Iron Duke, and lovely to see you again once again, Tim, to share a stream with you. Thank you for the invite. And of course, one of the hallowed days of our nation and its history, and I suppose sadly for men of our ilk, one tinged with a bit of sadness when we look at the state of our countries today. But when we actually I was listening to Tim talk about the lead up to the Gallipoli campaign, and if you've ever travelled to Gallipoli and seen Lone Pine and the landing grounds, you can only but have the utmost respect for what those young boys had to confront in that campaign. It was quite the task put before them, and to think that they fought with such tenacity and such such grit was very, very commendable. And it's no surprise that campaign, even though technically a defeat for the Commonwealth, has etched itself in our national psyche, and deservedly so.
Oh, look, go to the Australian National War Memorial in Canberra, Furious, and there's a lifeboat there from a Royal Navy warship full of bullet holes that actually conveyed the Australian troops onto the beach. So yeah, you can see it, and it's full of bullet holes. Because a lifeboat being rowed ashore is not a hard target to hit.
The Australian War Memorial, I encourage everybody to go and see it. I saw it for the first time in 2022 when I visited Canberra. It's so well. It's almost a perfect somber memorial, and it's obviously about remembering and educating people on all the conflicts, and also what are termed peacekeeping operations throughout Australia's history. And although the Australian government does contribute a lot to it, the private donations mean that they can expand the various memorials and educational facilities that are there.
I would just say the Australian National War Memorial in Canberra is almost the only reason to bother going to Canberra at all, and is one of the best war museums in the whole world. Definitely. That would be my view on that. I don't like Canberra. I don't think it's a nice place. It's where it is because it's out of range of 12-inch Russian naval guns in about 1900. Terrible place, Canberra. It's full of politicians and civil servants, neither of whom I like very much. But the Australian National War Memorial, that's one of the great war museums in the whole world. And if you're interested in military history, yeah, you've got to go there.
Absolutely. And the thing is that if we have sort of one small sort of dose of relief, is that, you know, on one hand, obviously these stories and these you know, this history and to some degree mythos, you know, in some ways it does buttress, you know, narratives of our respective governments and their, you know, and their sort of the ideology which they're built upon. That should be separated from the deeds of the fighting men who are called upon their country. And I think sometimes people either go all in on one direction or the other, and they should be made distinct, because in the end, we know what we know as a result of, you know, the internet and the proliferation of information, the ability to sort of, you know, pull apart and deconstruct things which were considered as given by, say, our parents and our grandparents and so on. And you know, I think it is not only is it dangerous, but I think it's also an exercise in folly that, you know, when you look at those photos of those men, and I mean, you know, they could be photographs of the you know, the light cavalry, you know, Beersheba, you know, in Palestine. It could be photos of the young men sort of disembarking from Gallipoli. It could be photos of World War II vets, you know, from Port Moresby, from North Africa, wherever they were serving and fighting, with great distinction in most cases. You know, I think throwing out the baby with the bathwater is bad. And, you know, insofar that these war memorials and these cemeteries and these other sort of you know, monuments to their deeds are maintained and kept at least pristine, even though our betters might use them for nefarious purposes, we should still be thankful for what they have done. And I mean, I know there's probably going to be people in the comments and even people on Twitter like, oh, but Furious, your grandfathers fought on the other side. And it's like, yes, that's true. But there's a reason why my grandfathers, well, actually only one fought against the Australians, did respect them. And then I think I've shared this story with you, Iron Duke, and maybe Tim, I don't know whether you were, I said this with you when we were together last time, but, you know, my grandfather's the kind of person who sort of let bygones be bygones. And often it was the RSL guys used to bring him up and say, listen, you know, come down to the War Memorial on Anzac Day or on Remembrance Day. We'd like you to be here. And that was kind of the great aspect of how those men viewed themselves in
that was
in
a fair
context
go.
of the war, you know.
Furious,
Yeah.
that was a fair go, which was 100% the Australian idea. You gave everyone a fair go.
Absolutely.
Back in the day, which is being destroyed today, of course, as you and Tim both know.
Absolutely.
You know, we live in on an Australia today where the weak Australian Prime Minister would like to destroy Elon Musk. And I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk, but you know what? He's more in favor of free speech than the Australian Prime Minister is. So.
Indeed.
And the thing is, those old Australian diggers in World War One and World War Two and Korea and everywhere else they fought, most of those guys thought Australia was a free country.
Absolutely. And the Australia of yesteryear was.
It kind of ain't today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, that's true
for
that's true for the Anglosphere writ large, and indeed for most European countries. But you know, it is worth saying that you know, there was a time, and these men lived in that time where countries like Australia, for the most part, were. and it was a lovely society, and it's actually the kind of society that attracted people here for good reason. They didn't come here for like the the Gibbs and this that and the other. It's like, no, it was a land of a fair go and a land of opportunity and a land where the government didn't actually molest its people, so to speak. But I just wanted to reiterate the point, because again, it was a point that sort of Tim emphasizes, that I personally felt quite overwhelmed, because I've actually been to Singapore a number of times. I've had friends there and I've had reasons to go, etc. And I remember walking through this big cemetery, an Allied cemetery there, and when you start to peer at the names on those tombstones and the birth years and the date of deceased on them, and you sort of start to realize that these men were sort of 18, 19, 22, 23 years old, and they've hardly had a chance to live. People like us should actually spare a thought for that, because there's nothing. I think there's few. I don't want to say there's no greater tragedy, but there's few greater tragedies than men who part with their lives in the line of duty for service to something greater than them. And for those of us who actually are genuinely on the right, we have to have a respect for that, at least in some sense, and not forget that. And whether you go to
100%.
Singapore, whether you go to Gallipoli, whether you go to the War Memorial, in Canberra, or even if you just have a monument in your local, shire, or your local suburb, whatever. Because often, like a lot of old town, whether it's Brisbane or Melbourne or Sydney or Perth or wherever, heck, even go to some country towns, they'll have often like an artillery piece or something and a memorial, and just take it in for a few minutes and be grateful that people like us aren't in that situation.
Furious. I've seen Australian dudes dead in Crete, which is a Greek island you all know about, and in Singapore and Malaysia and what have you. 100% agree with you. Tim, what's your thinking on this?
Well, I concur with Furious. We've got to separate from the politicians who make the decisions about going to war or sending troops overseas, and the people who sign up. We have to remember that the ADF, the D stands for Australian. D for Defence, Australian Defence Forces, and so that is why young men mainly sign up because we do need a national defence. But as part of the contract, you have to go where those who make the decisions go. And so I agree with Furious. You have to separate and because it's like when there's a war, I think. Imagine thinking that you are more likely to die or at the very least be maimed than come out unscathed. It's something that we cannot comprehend. I'm sure, though, that if hypothetically there was our nation was under threat, under siege from a foreign adversary, because self-preservation, survival, it can unleash the strengths and determination that we never thought that we had. But going back to what Furious was saying, the fact that these men, they're signing up for First Aid Defence Force, and obviously, if there's a war, they do not know whether what their rate of survival is. They won't know. A lot of them won't know how it will end. And that's who we're remembering on Anzac Day. Certainly, the fact that they put themselves in, were willing to put themselves, their lives on the line in ways that we could never comprehend.
Furious, what are you You muted me.
Oh, it might
Curious?
be. It might be off the computer screen for a moment. I mean,
Oh, okay, fair enough. Well, I do. The thing is, you join the military first of all because it's a male deal. I can kind of talk about this because I did join the British Army when I was 80. And then I joined the South African Defence Force because I didn't want to serve in Germany. But yeah, you join the army initially because, it's a male thing to do. And all the blokes in your family do that. It's kind of a rite of passage, I guess. And you're right, Tim. You don't know what war you're going to get sent to because you have no control over that. You get sent to whatever war our
this is why
supposed elites want to send us to.
the treatment of the Vietnam veterans in Australia and the United States was appalling.
I kind of agree. Yeah, I do kind of agree with that. Yeah.
I mean, be angry at your governments who they lied, and they're the ones who told these young men, you're going here because going to fight in Vietnam, because if you don't, then the domino effect of communism is going to see it go all the way down Asia to potentially Australia. And the fact that when they got back the public, who took out the anger on them, which was absolutely appalling. And
privates and sergeants. You're totally right, Tim. And yet, you can go and watch a film like Danger Close, which is a fairly recent Australian movie. One Australian company, which was like about 108 guys, taking on a whole battalion of main force NVA. So they were outnumbered, 10 to 1, pretty much. Those guys who fought in Vietnam at places like Long Tan absolutely, totally lived up to the Anzac spirit. They absolutely did as well as any Anzacs ever did. They were as brave could be. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, and they didn't lose. And yet, as you rightly say, Tim, the Australian civilian public treated them pretty badly when they came home, even though they fought as bravely as any Australians ever had.
Though the overall result of the war was that all of Vietnam did become communist, and so it was the double insult to Vietnam veterans. They were shunned when they got back, and then when the Vietcong North Vietnamese captured Saigon, there's also the realization our sacrifice was all for nothing. It was the first war for the United States where they didn't achieve their objectives, and we've recently come out of the Afghanistan war, which lasted longer than the Vietnam War. Again, our diggers, all the Allied soldiers died for nothing. And then, of course, we had the Brereton report, which talked about how Australian soldiers there allegedly committed war crimes, and it was
Bullshit.
yeah, but it was. That's why I said alleged, but let me finish my point. This was basically the politicians and the military top brass trying to making the front line troops be the scapegoats for a war that they had lost, which was absolutely disgraceful.
100%, mate. 100%. I don't believe the claims of war crimes at all. Not even slightly, I've got to say.
And Ben Robert Smith, he was snapped at a Perth Anzac Day event, and he hasn't been charged by any military tribunal. He simply lost a defamation case against Channel 9 and Nix McKenzie, which was decided by one federal court judge, same as the Brittany Higgins Bruce Lehrman. This is not a jury trial tried by 12 of your peers. This is just one judge, and it's the balance of probabilities, which is the judge can decide 51%. That's more probable than not.
I don't think that you can judge your military forces that way. If you send a military into an area,
or urban warfare as well, which is
Yeah.
you don't know who the enemy is, and both Vietnam and Afghanistan you're in a country fighting a war. It's a civil war, basically. You don't know if the local Afghani or local Vietnamese is allied to your side, or they from the enemy side.
you've got less than a second when you might see a guy with an AK-47 fired at you or aimed at you, and this dude has to make that decision in that time. Sorry, that is not something for a court. It's not. Don't send the guys there if you're going to do that. Don't send the guys there at all if you're going to do that. That's my opinion anyway.
I mean, compare a Afghanistan and Vietnam to World War II. I mean, the enemy that the Anzacs were fighting was pretty identifiable because they were a different race.
Well, yeah, except in Europe, and
I'm talking about the Pacific War, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I see what you're saying, Tim. But I mean, the other thing is, there were definitely Allied soldiers who did bad things in World War II, but of course, they were never prosecuted because we had this thing that went on after World War II that somehow the Axis powers were all totally evil.
The history is,
and in some cases that was true, but in many cases it wasn't.
And we're also allowed to have conversations without disrespecting those who served, died, or were maimed about if World War I, World War II, i.e. the various other Vietnam War and Afghanistan War could have been avoided. And that's where we get into it's important to separate from those who are serving, who are ordered to do the fighting, and those who make the decisions.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Furious, could I just
Sorry, I'm back.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. I'm glad you're back. Furious, we were just talking, all right? And
I did catch most of it, by the way.
Well, there were Australian special forces recently who were accused but not convicted of war crimes. And then before that, Tim and I were talking about Long Tan, which was the biggest Australian battle in Vietnam. About 108 Australian diggers versus a whole North Vietnamese main force regiment. And as I said, like those guys in Long Tan absolutely lived up to the highest expectations of anyone who believes the Anzac thing, because you know they were outnumbered about 10-1, you know, and they didn't lose. You know, they held their positions. They did not lose. But then Tim and I got on to special forces guys in Afghanistan, accused of but not convicted of killing some bloody Afghan, because you know you've got half a second to decide is he going to shoot me or is he not, you know, and you know, I don't know. I don't think many of us would be all that great.
Yeah. Well, I'll start chronologically then. Actually, just if I may, just when my microphone went a bit, bazinga, I kind of caught what so Tim was saying before about like the idea of like these men being called for war and sort of what they did and what was expected and asked of them. We have to also consider that many great nations throughout history have become great because they've had a strong military culture. And, this realization obviously offends people of either a liberal or an egalitarian mindset. But there are very specific virtues, and I will call them virtues, that coincide with a militaristic culture, that coincide with a shall we even call it, well, I don't want to use the word bellicose, because it's not necessarily that people or a nation should be at war all the time. It's not necessarily what I mean, but that people should have within them a capacity to be able to defend themselves and to protect their interests, and where necessary, when coming into conflict with an adversary, they are able to fight with proficiency and distinction. I'm sure this chat will be like, "Oh, Furious going to talk about the Romans again," but we can see this all the way from Persia and Assyria in the the Bronze Age up until
Furious is. I know you like the Romans, and so do I, but it's not even that. It's like we all know that, like Gauls, like proficient, brave, stand-up soldiers. They just do, and that's always been the case.
But the fact is that history shows us that those nations and people who are proficient at it become great. They're able to stamp their authority in their sphere, and they are the ones who make the biggest imprint on society. That is why, for instance, for a large part of history up until like what we call the Dark Ages, even though I hate that term, the Near East was predominantly Persian, culturally and linguistically and even religiously. They adhered to Zoroastrianism. It is why, for the most part, the Mediterranean, certainly up until relatively modern times and prior to the Ottomans, much of the Mediterranean was sort of Latin and Greek. One might call it a Roman sphere of sorts. And Northern Europe has been primarily Celtic and Germanic, because they were the preeminent people of that part of the world, and were able to protect their interests and expand accordingly. And we can see those interests. We can see that the impacts of that evolutionary history play out even now. I mean, that's why the Irish and Scots are who they are. It's why the English are who they are to a point. It's why the French are an amalgam of a few people who have conquered and dominated Gaul. And the kind of modern Fukuyama mindset, or the kind of mindset that one will inevitably confront when they go to school in the modern days, like, oh no, all these things are bad. There is no virtues in this, or it's authoritarian and dictatorial and tyrannical and whatever. It oversimplifies something that is essential to human nature, and that is essential to, shall I say, the way in which cultures interact with each other. Because despite what we're told, often different people, different cultures will have opposing interests. And heck, if you look at a map of battles fought in Europe often even people of the same kin and kith will have that same, will have juxtaposed interests as well. And so, people of our worldview actually understand that this is an indelible part of humanity. And that, if we bring it back to like the Anzacs for a second, there is a reason why up until, relatively modern times, whether it was the British observing Australian performance in the Boer War or in World War One and World War Two, whether it was the Germans or the Italians talking about the Australians, because remember in the Italian context, they were allies in World War One and then enemies in the Second World War. Whether it's the way the Turks spoke about the Australians fighting at Anzac Cove, realizing that the Australians were essentially subject people's not the right way to say it, but we're like a subsidiary of the British Empire. We're like a little cousin of Britain, right? That were brought to these shores to fight the Turks. The Australian was seen as, this sort of almost behemoth frontier creature, that was sort of on one hand a bit of a larrikin, a bit lighthearted, but also, was tenacious and gritty and determined and, hard to dislodge in defense, and was brave on the attack. And, people from Ataturk to Rommel lauded the Australians, and I mean, to their credit, also the New Zealanders. Often they'd say, if I had a unit of these guys, I would have won my campaign or won the war. And what is so saddening is that the virtues that built that man has vanished.
Furious. One of the things that I notice is that, like, the Australian mythos used to be the outback. What's the word? I can't remember.
The Bushman, the Jack.
Yeah, it used to be it used to be kind of Crocodile Dundee, It used to be the Australian guy was this outback guy who would ride horses and wrestle crocodiles and was just, a total badass, that used to be the Australian mythos. Of course, it was not true, because Australia was one of the most urban countries in the world, So the vast majority of these guys who went and joined the Australian Light Horse, etc., came from Melbourne or Sydney or wherever, Brisbane, Perth. Australians have really been very urbanized, but the guys who everyone in Australia has mythologized and loved have been the guys from small country towns. Australian cowboys are ringers, if you talk about cowboys in the American West, that's in Australia, that's ringers. But they're a tiny proportion of Australians. But yeah, everything you say is totally true. But there's just loads of lies about what Australians are like,
Well, obviously, it's why Steve Irwin was so popular, because of that Australian mythos, the crocodile hunter.
100%, man. 100%.
And the only politician who sort of would fit the Australian mythos would probably be Bob Catter. I don't know for sure whether he's wrestled with saltwater crocodiles, but you sort of you believe that probably he's the only one that really could tame the crocs. I mean, he's the only sort of a real, well, he's as his own party, he's the only one who really real maverick in the parliament, and famously has 2 gears with his larrikin laugh, and then his aggro super serious.
It's interesting. I've been looking for this excerpt, and I thought I didn't actually have it, but I found it. If I may, Andrew, can I read it?
100, mate, go for it.
So it's an observation about sort of the Australian man from the First World War, and it's sort of like basically buttresses the point that we're all making here, and it's sort of contingent to this wider observation that, you know, it is almost it's a tragedy, and it's pitiful to sort of consider that the kind of men that this country once produced and was in some ways, you know, certainly from a standpoint of combativeness and physicality, was the envy of the world. And I mean, you know,
Panic Canberra. Furious. I don't know if you caught this because it was early in the stream, but in World War II, the first Allied nation to be, the first Western Allied nation to beat the Germans on land was the Australians at Tobruk. And
where my grandfather was actually.
yeah. And the first Allied nation to beat the Japanese on land in New Guinea again was the Australians. And given Australia back then had like, I don't know, 5 million people, maybe. That was a pretty good deal from Australia's point of view. Like, Australia had some damn good fighting men, you know?
Absolutely.
And Australians who do the pilgrimage, the expedition to Kokoda, I mean, they struggle just as civilians.
They struggle to walk it, mate. Yeah,
having 100%. Your basically your whole kit and rifles. There it was absolutely, and well, we wonder how they did it. And this is the other aspect of war, that it is, you're not just, it's not just when the guns are firing, but going through what is probably some of the most brutal parts of nature as well.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think we could agree amongst the two of us that
Barrett is trying to tell us we got lucky twice. No, Australian men had a certain steel in them. Like back in 1940, they had a certain steel in them. I'm sorry.
No.
You're not right.
No. Oh, good, Andrew. No, I'm just going to make the point that the Australians distinguished themselves in two of the three most difficult terrains in which to fight in, and one is dense, humid jungle, and you got to think, you know, with bugs and parasites and leeches and all that, you know, and the lack of fresh water. You have issues with, you know, typhus and dysentery and whatever. Like, that's a hellish place in which to fight, and then of course that, you know, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea aren't that dissimilar to Vietnam in that sense. And the other climate they distinguish themselves is the desert. You got to think, like, the desert, there's even less water than in a jungle atmosphere. And yes, you don't have the dense jungle and the humidity, but you got the parched, hot desert. You know, they're just relentless, and, you know, sand gets into everything. And in much in the same way that you have difficulties, say, with, you know, particularly if you have like waterways or torrential monsoons, you have mud and whatever. You know, the same thing in Africa is, you know, like dust gets into, you know, carburetors and filters and, you know, brakes, and, you know, it gets in your nostrils and whatever, and flies everywhere, which my grandfather just, he had a hatred of flies, you know, till the end of his life because of what he confronted in Africa. And the third most difficult climate, which is the one that the Australians didn't fight in, is the other extreme of cold and snow. And, you know, you read some of the excerpts of you know, of the Eastern Front, for instance, in World War II, and, like, you know, like men having to fight in, you know, negative 20-30 degree temperatures, and men suffering frostbite, and men freezing to death in their trenches. Like, that's the only place where the Australians didn't fight and distinguish themselves, because they weren't there. But the Australians did well in two of those three examples. And like you say, Iron Duke actually performed the initial, you know, the first initial setbacks of the Axis, you know, at the hands of Australians. But before I forget, I just want to read this excerpt, because I'd love for you two to hear it, and for our listeners to hear it, if I may. Towards the end of the First World War, it was written that Australian soldiers thought, and quote, life was very dear, but life was not worth living unless they could be true to their idea of Australian manhood. Standing upon that alone, When help failed and help faded, when the end loomed clear in front of them, when the whole world seemed to crumble and the heavens to fall in, they faced their own ruin undismayed and dauntless. Australian men, separate quote. Australian men were universally regarded as physical perfection. An English journalist named Ashmead Bartlett wrote, quote, I do not suppose any country in its palmiest days ever sent forth to the field of battle a finer body of men than these Australian, New Zealand, and Tasmanian troops. Physically, they are the finest men that I've ever seen in any part of the world. In fact, I had no idea such a race of giants existed in the 20th century. Some of their battalions average a height of 5'10", and every man seems to be a trained athlete with well-defined muscle and immense stamina. Now, that is an Englishman observing the physical prowess of an Australian. And just as I was sort of saying before we got a bit derailed, if you were to cast a drone over modern day Australians, now if they weren't what few bushmen and farmers exist, and even a lot of those guys aren't fit and strong anymore, or like a bunch of surfies or a bunch of tradies who kind of half look after their health, much of the rest of the Australian male population does not reflect that. Not remotely.
There's still some good guys, Furious, like Chris Gard, for example.
Oh, I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying they're very rare.
Yeah, he's a typical Aussie bloke who's a big dude. But yeah, I agree with you. And of course, this was because that generation of Australians had grown up in cities, small towns, and in the countryside with pretty good food. So they were quite tall.
Australia's become way more urbanized in the 21st century. But I'll also add that our governments actively suppress patriots wanting to serve. And when I say patriots, I mean that supposedly the conservative side of politics wants the young people to be proud of their country and its achievements. But if you are a patriot who believes in traditional Australia, then you're actively discouraged and purged from the Defence Force and government positions to defend the nation. And it's the same in the UK as well. Why you
100%,
see,
100%.
why you see this sort of panic amongst the political class. Oh, nobody wants to go and fight for the UK and maybe to fight Russia, and it's also because the wars that the elites want to fight aren't in the interests of our countries. It's this multi-level disassociation, disjointedness, which is why they on I think on days like today, we sort of think about obviously you're a British expat, Iron Duke, think about how all of our countries are going when it comes to actual defense, because there was that the absolute disgrace of the Met Police attacking English patriots on St. George's Day. Maybe if they'd had
totally agree, man.
The updated Nike St. George's crosses, maybe the Met Police would have danced with them instead.
Oh, look, Tim, I'm very conscious that I am not an Australian. I'm a plum. I'm a plummy bastard, as Australians used to say. Although I have to say that in 24 years, I've never really heard that used to be in a bad way. But then I am 6'2" and 200 pounds, so whatever. But on the whole, you don't hear that in a bad way from Australians. And speaking as a Pommy who's lived in Australia for 24 years, I have to totally agree with you, Tim. Like when I first got here in about 2000, Australia was almost like the most perfect country in the world if you wanted to have like a fair, good country, you know. Really, I'm not even joking. Like coming here, I came here from South Africa, not from England, but Australia was almost like the most perfect country you could get. And today, it's so ever increasingly like every other Western Anglo country with vast amounts of mass immigration, etc. And it's like the people who rule Australia don't want it to be Australia. They want to destroy it, which again, I think is like all the guys who rule the Western world. They don't want our countries to be like they used to be anymore.
No, and although they, like on days like today, talk about freedom and sacrifice, they don't realize the irony in them saying that while 364 days of the year they're discussing ways to restrict our freedom. Don't forget, I saw that Topher Field today reshared when he attended a public Anzac Day event in the town of Trafalgar in Gippsland in Victoria. Remember that our freedom to commemorate Anzac Day 2020 was taken away just like that. We were all banned from leaving our homes, apart from whatever the 4 reasons we could only leave the home if the government deemed we had an essential reason. And there certainly wasn't at that time much reflection. Hey, they fought for our freedom that is just being taken away from us just like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like that. Just like that. Furious, what do you think, mate?
Yeah, it's a pretty dire sort of situation in that sense. And it's one of these things that, I know we are obviously compelled, and rightly so, to discuss how we feel about a day such as this and try and find the good and the bad in it. And that means obviously being, showing deference and respect to better men who have come before us and in many instances have paid an ultimate sacrifice that will never likely be asked of us. And then secondly, to sort of ponder upon the situation in which we find ourselves. These men left behind a great nation and a sort of burgeoning culture that had the potential to be whatever it could
they
be.
would vomit on today. Furious.
Precisely.
Most of the old Anzacs would vomit on modern Australia. They would say this was not
modern,
the country.
The modern West. Yeah,
100%.
It's a universal principle in that sense.
Yeah.
And I suppose people like us that do this, and I mean, I don't know what you'd even call this, but we have an obligation to obviously speak truths to people who listen to us, but at the same time, we can't leave. It's also not right to just sort of indulge in black pills and be all negative and leave a desert and call it peace, to use the old quotation. But there are instances of things to be hopeful for. It's just that we find ourselves in a difficult time, and it's just it is in itself difficult and troublesome, for all of us. And I mean, we can't change the situation for what it is directly, but we just have to find, and it behooves us to sort of find a balance between that, that sadness and deference, but also that appreciation and that gratitude. And then, looking forward to the future, things might be difficult, but at the same time, what would these men who have come before us have done in our situation, and how would they feel about things? And then what can we do? Because, it's sort of something that's endemic in our circles. And, I know people call it black pilling, and I don't even like the word necessarily, but, if you just sort of, put your hands in your pockets and shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, it's too difficult, it's all over. Well, it's all for nothing. And I mean, that's not a solution, and that's not the right way forward. So, we should use, or not, I don't want to use the word use because it sounds exploitative, but, people like us ought to feel, shall I say, a bit inspired by days such as Anzac Day, insofar that, we can reflect on these things and hopefully work towards something better.
Furious, could I ask you? I don't disagree with anything you just said, but like, I am 100% convinced that if the old Anzacs from World War II or even the Vietnam War could come back now and looked at the state of Australia today, I think they would want to vomit. I'm sure they wouldn't because they were tough dudes, but what do you think they would say?
I think if you showed them video footage, and forget showing them today, insofar that the few that are alive and still, are of sound mind and body, God willing, you're a different man when you're at the, the sunset of life. But if you had shown them images of, for instance, that the footage from just the stabbing here over East, a couple of weeks ago, or like the London Bridge attack or whatever, like you could show them all that footage on repeat, and as as healthy, brave, combative, virile, young 20, 30 odd year old men, they would be pissed, and they would be absolutely aghast that their descendants had allowed our countries, because I mean, I use that word collectively because it's not just Australia, it's the Anglosphere and it's Europe by and large, that our betters, and I hate to use that word because they're not actually better than us, but our so-called elites have done this, and in some cases, by default, and in other cases, with malevolent and intent and willfulness, have done this to us and have brought our birthright, our inheritance to ruin. And that is the thing that, we need to keep in mind. And it's a disgrace. And that's what they would be appalled at.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, mate. Tim, what do you think, mate?
I mean, mentioning the fact that I saw, I think it was a Blair Cottrell posted today on his account, which I thought was quite poignant about what the powers that be are reshaping Anzac Day. So he posted, local Anzac services today consisted of standing around for hours listening to propagandized old people prattling on about inclusion and trying to justify present day international peacekeeping, read dying for Israel. These ceremonies need an overhaul. More drums, more marching, shorter speeches focused on a national identity, not hour-long ramblings about seditious modern values, which not a single Anzac soldier knew anything about and certainly did not die for. And this is something that, again, we're getting into the we were never asked. This is just something that was bipartisanly decided. And I remember when I went to the Shrine of Remembrance on Anzac Day 2019, Dan Andrews said he paid respects to the traditional owners of the land. And then what were the Anzacs fighting for if it wasn't their land?
100%, Tim. 100%.
We have, and I was talking about this before, both sides of the binary political divide. They try to like there's only two positions on the Anzacs. That's obviously the Conservatives. They died for our freedom, paid the ultimate sacrifice, and then you sort of have there was the Antifa leftists. They liked Anzac Day for a while because it was about defeating the Nazis. Like, so
They like it when it suits them, right?
yes, but now there was the what is it? The Students for Palestine. It looked like they were trying to set up today at Melbourne Uni another liberated zone, and then they're outside Parliament House calling it, saying Anzac Day glorifies war. How can it be glorifying war if we're remembering just how many were killed in wars?
Yeah.
So you have these basically. There's only two positions. This is why we do what we do, to have a deeper conversation and a deeper reflection than you tend to get from the politicians and the activists. The like sort of there's you get one narrow worldview of Anzac Day on Sky News and one narrow worldview on the ABC. I mean, we all agree that Sky News Australia certainly just has this, or just sort of say it has itself as what's supposedly the standard conservative view about everything Australia.
I'd agree with that.
Because also the Conservatives today, they also talk about that our values are now multiculturalism. What is that? How many times in the past 6 months we have said Australia is the most successful multicultural country?
They say it, the more it is obviously not true, Tim. The more you see it's not true, because really what they're doing is making Australia more multicultural all the time. And that is the proof that it don't work, you know? It's like, I remember back in 2000, Australia was pretty unicultural, I'd say, but Australia was the best place in the entire universe. And if you didn't like Australia, then most Australians would tell you to get fucked and go away. Which I thought was perfectly reasonable.
Yeah,
I thought that was perfectly reasonable in 2000, you know, because back then Australia was a damn good place, you know.
I'm sure all of us have. Sorry, Tim. I just very quickly. I'm sure all of us have very vivid memories of how many Ford or Commodore Utes or Toyota Traybacks, with the infamous Australian flag sticker with the F off, or whatever, or what is it? F off, we're full, and almost like every second tradies Ute had one, and those stickers are rare these days. You rarely see them. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, put this way, as someone, as someone who, I mean, I was obviously born here, but as someone whose family came to Australia post-war, it's kind of that things like, yeah, I actually agree with this statement. Like I emphatically agree with this sentiment being expressed.
I was a Palm who came here from South Africa in 2000, and I absolutely thought, perfectly reasonable Australian thing to say, but it's not the same as today at all, because today it's all about diversity and like how many people can you bring in from China or the Indian subcontinent or whatever, who are never going to become Australians, and it doesn't matter how long they're here. All it's going to do is destroy Australia as a nation, basically.
Although the response to that is, how good is the food and cricket? Because, well, it was part of the British Empire, and certainly they don't have much of a colonial grudge like the Chinese do. So the reason why there is this pivot to India by Australia's political leaders is because, well, they've got the same British colonial heritage that we.
So they claim, Tim. So they claim. I don't know. I used to like the Ashes Test series between England and Australia because it was 11 Australians versus 11 Englishmen. That's not true anymore because both countries have people who are not from.
But
there.
if they help our respective countries win, like that's the most important thing. I mean, there's obviously, well, most famous a non-white Australian cricketer Usman Khawaja, who he decided to jump on the pro-Palestine, the anti-Israel war bandwagon, and had those shoes. What is it? All lives are equal, because you can't say all lives matter. But a lot of us still bit our tongues because he's really good, and he also. When those MCC members were being all rambunctious after Australia won the second test at Lords, pulled them up as well. So, Tim,
the only thing I can say is many moons ago, I went to Lords for a Lords Ashes Test match, and I got about 28 overs, if I remember rightly, and two Aussies who were sitting behind me actually started speaking to me because I swore so much. I used to be a soldier, so I do swear quite badly, particularly when England are not doing well. So, I mean, not now because I don't follow sports at all. But these two Aussies started chatting to me. And after 28 overs, we went to the Lords Cricket Museum and drank a lot, basically, and got on absolutely fabulously, as generally Aussies and Brits do, in my experience, if they get to know each other. But yeah, these days I don't watch sports, mate. I just don't.
I still do, and like I follow the AFL, even though, because it's like sport originally was an outlet for a lot of Australians to get away from the grind and also our various differences, but it's now become fused with the cultural, political issues. I saw Mr. Bogan in a comment said that the AFL game spent more time welcome to country than they did in the Anzac observance. I saw this. Uncle Colin is a very light-skinned Aboriginal with his holds his leaves and does on behalf of the people welcome, and goes through basically a whole mini history there. It's again the contradiction I spoke about with Dan Andrews saying, "Oh, this is a spare respect to the traditional owners." Yeah, like not real. Do they understand the cognitive dissonance of all of this? And they do remember that there were Aboriginal Anzacs as well. So, supposedly, if Aboriginals, if it was so horrible, the European settlement, then why did they fight to defend it?
Good point.
Absolutely. But as we know, these individuals and groups intellectual consistency and integrity is hardly their forte. And frankly, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have none at all. But these are lessons we've known for years, and we just sort of accept them as a as a fundamental truism of modern day ideological discourse and politics. No, but I totally agree, Tim. You're very right. And the other thing, just quickly, as like the utility of sport, and I say this as someone who grew up in a country town, is that one of the great tragedies is that you drive through, and I mean, I haven't traversed much of, say, I think I've been to Sydney like twice. I actually haven't even been to like the hinterland of New South Wales. But, I'm very familiar with, parts of Queensland. I'm very familiar with parts of Victoria. Very familiar with parts of WA. You take a drive out of any major city or even like a big town and you go to the smaller places. I'm talking places that have, less than 5,000 people, less than 1,000 people. Some towns have less than 500, and some towns have a population of barely a couple of dozen. You find a place with, say, a wheat bin and a post office and a pub. That's that in some instances is the total sum of a town, and there might be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 homesteads in that little place, and it just has like a mile marker and like one or two signs, northwest or north, south, or east, west indicate where it is, and during harvest time, the town's full of trucks delivering wheat or barley, whatever. And then, for the other 10 months of the year, it's quiet as anything. And you look at those places and, when a lot of these places were either settled or built up, from, say, like the tail end of the 1800s into sort of certainly pre-World War I and to some degree pre-World War II, what was the basis of these townships? It was a post office, it was a wheat bin, and oftentimes a bit of extra infrastructure if it found itself like on a railway line or a railway junction, which was sort of important, especially back then, to move around people and goods, particularly in the far reaches of the outback, that have a primary school, that, a pub, a post office. And what was one of the other things that sort of created a nucleus for these towns? A footy oval, a cricket pitch. Later in time, maybe like a soccer ground or some tennis courts or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And this is why, even up until relatively recent times, Australians and like like our whole Olympic and sports and athletic infrastructure has very often, not always, but has very, very often punched above its weight in terms of the amount of population we have, the resources and money we have in terms of like the overall size of the economy compared to like an America or China or a Russia or even like a Germany or Britain or Italy or something like that, right? We're still very of modest. We've always been of modest means in that sense, and yet punching above our weight. Why? Because even the smallest of towns with the most modest of populations with the most meager of resources up until very recent times has produced these specimens that have been drawn from very tough conditions, and they've had to adapt and they've had to be tough and resilient. And when they've had the talent and the mentorship and the training and coaching to go with it, have then made it to the elite level and performed excellently. Like even that has now become an almost extinct pathway these days. Like it doesn't happen anymore. But sport, and why I don't think we should throw away the baby with the bathwater. And I got a second little minor addendum to this, is that it was such a fundamental part of that frontier lifestyle in a sense and a social cohesion. And then the second point I want to make about sport is that there's actually something about sport and not this sort of modern commercialized, like, slop, garbage that we're fed on the TV, like NFL and, basket NBA and whatever, like NBL. It's just like, that's a trash, right? But there is something inherently right-wing coded about sport. It's the idea of a winner and a loser. It's the idea of some respects of a continuation of both like a Greco-Roman tradition of physical excellence that actually has like some kind of Aristotelian or Socratic ideal of like a citizen should know the peak performance of his body, and if he doesn't do that, he's being derelict in his duty as a citizen, which is very sort of like Greco-Roman coded. And then there's this sort of Western, high medieval chivalric noble ideal of like two men jousting in the arena against each other, and that it is two men no matter their station in the aristocracy and there's nothing in between them. There's no I mean, within obviously certain like chivalric code limits, but like it's just those two, no external factors. When they'd have their fighting tournaments, right, with swords or axes, right, it's two men battling it out in the arena against each other, not to the death, not like the gladiators, but demonstrating their martial and physical prowess in a very masculine way, but also in a slightly like elevated sense. I say this exists on a higher transcendental plane. You cannot tell me, well, I mean, not that you guys are, but a person cannot tell me plausibly that there is something not inherently perennial or traditional or right-wing in that. There is something so inherently, traditional in that is actually etched, especially in us as Europeans. And the only like couple of examples I can find that don't exist in the West is that there's a somewhat of like a horse-bearing sports competitive sort of equivalent that exists in like the Levant and amongst the Arabs and Persians, which is true. And also the Persians have a history of wrestling as well. And then, we see those exhibitions of, like, the Mongols on horseback, they do like foot archery and target shooting and stuff. And the Mongols are worry people in their own way. And then you've got like the Japanese practice of Bushido and like, the samurai, disciplines of, like archery and, wielding the katana and dueling and this sort of stuff. But that's it. Like that's the rest of the world doesn't have this tradition. And yet it is so inherently etched and coded in being European. And we shouldn't forget that.
Well, that's
Furious. Can I just say, when I arrived in Australia in 2000, Don Bradman was still alive, and like he was a living legend as the best cricketing batsman that ever been. He just was, you got
still is, in my opinion.
100. I'm not disagreeing at all. You got that great 1930 song, Don Bradman. And my dad, right, who was born in 1933, his father took him to a test match just after World War II, specifically to see Don Bradman bat. And surprise, surprise, Don Bradman didn't make any runs, but he did. So yeah, I 100% agree.
Yeah.
With everything you said there, mate. Basically.
Yeah, no, it's just something that we shouldn't overlook because there's the adulteration and the usurpation of the phenomena, but then there's sort of something more underlying and inherent that actually does belong to us.
The old dudes back in the day.
Yeah.
I don't think I paid no attention to the modern stuff, but the old dudes, like back in the day when Don Bradman was like a hero of the whole British Empire, for God's sake. He wasn't just a hero of Australia. He was a hero of the whole British Empire. Everyone knew him.
Absolutely.
And nobody disliked him because, he was an Australian. So that didn't make him like some sort of alien to the Brits. And no matter how badly he beat us sometimes, we just thought, fucking hell, he's just great,
Yeah. Well, he was still an exemplar of a British ideal, playing a British sport, to which point, Australia still ostensibly is. I don't know if you've heard, if either of you have heard me say this before, I'm pretty sure I've said it on AA shows, that Australia was, and for at least the meantime, remains the greatest exemplar of, the British flag, of Britannia, of British and English culture transplanted somewhere else in the world, and another sort of bastion of it established, literally on the opposite side of the world. I think Australia has been that and remains that, and someone like Don Bradman is that. And I just want to run this past Tim, because I know he's a cricket fan, is that, how you said he was the best batsman, and I said he'll remain so, is because one of the reasons I actually can't watch cricket anymore, like irrespective of the, like kind of demonstrative nonsense of the regime, etc., is that one thing about modernity and modern sport I actually can't fathom is the lack of attention span. I used to just, I loved in summer, like, coming home from swimming lessons or, coming off the harvester with dad and like watching, Mark Taylor and Mark Wall.
All day. Yeah,
all
yeah,
day, right?
yeah.
And I'd have my
means
and I'd
all
have my
day,
and
yeah.
I would have my
100.
Slazenger V100 and then a V800 because I was a massive Mike War fan. You know, just in my hand. You know, because I would just anticipate every bowl of every over, and now it's just cricket has been turned into yet another serving of entertainment slop that 2020 and run chases and records and stuff. And I watch cricket now and I almost have an apoplexy because of the horrid technique. And I'll tell you guys a little anecdote actually. I used to have a cricket coach who used to have because I actually played fairly competitively like growing up. And he used to have a box of balls like for the bowling machine, but then he have like a second bucket of balls. And what he used to do is because he was such a stickler for technique, is that if I moved my foot before the ball was ejected from the machine, as in before it spat it out, he would have like another ball in his opposite hand, and then ditch the ball at my helmet. And I learnt footwork discipline by being treated in that way. And people are like, oh my God, that's not politically correct. Like it's assault and, whatever. But,
Yeah,
I became a
everyone
very
gets
good batsman
surprised,
because I was
man.
taught in a very old fashioned way.
Everyone
And I mean,
gets surprised.
exactly. And I'm sure you'll agree, Tim,
That's not the
modern batting
way it
form
used
is
to be.
just disgusting. They have no technique anymore.
Well, I'm very happy to listen to what Tim wants to say about cricket because I used to adore cricket as like something between civilization and war. I don't think that anymore, but Tim, talk about cricket.
Oh, like you, Ferris, I grew up with when the summer came around. The test series was the main game, and obviously there was one day cricket as well, which was also very very exciting. Even though there's the 2020 and there's the Big Bash League, and then there's so many Cricket World Cups now. There's what is it? Cricket World Cup, Champions Trophy,
Yeah, the
T20.
2020 World, yeah,
But
all of that.
it still always comes back to the test series, the test tours, and cricket it's not just about the skill as well, but also the concentration and the also having to strategize and think forward, and that is why the captain is it's more important than
100,
other
mate.
sports.
100.
Cricket's one of the few inversions where you might say the role of the coach and the captain. Would you agree, Tim? In some ways,
It is because they're out there for the 3 sessions a day, and so the coach is there obviously in between tests and that, but the captain is there. There's only 11 players, so decisions have to be made fast, and they can only be made by somebody who's playing like is on the field and how things have been. And because imagine if the coach had to come on and every now and then and see how the ball's going. And
See, Tim understands cricket perfectly, which is it's an Anglo-Celtic thing. Tim just gets it. Someone in the chat said I'm a pom. I am a pom. Right? I loved the Beaufort matches when England were going to lose and didn't. But cricket used to be this something between sport and war, but it was also still friendly. And
also mix in sort of chess as well. It's
yeah.
A tactical game as well.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
been a gentlemanly element to cricket which has slowly eroded and has eroded more quickly in recent times. Like for instance, I hate to say this. It's just I'm sure it's just my sentiment towards it. I presume you guys would agree, but Cummins isn't fit to polish Steve Waugh's boots, and that's only like a generation removed, essentially. You know, the type of man. You know, we talk about the degradation of the man who fights in war. Well, there's been a degradation of the man who competes in sport as well, and the trajectories have been quite similar if you look at two graphs.
He's still like, as I was saying, before, we bite us Aussies, we bite our tongue because he's a winner, and despite we deplore his politics, he does make some ruthless decisions, which is what you need. But again, this is and it's the same with AFL and football as well. There's players whose activism you can't stand, but you bite your tongue. I'm a big football soccer fan myself, and because it's been basically the fifth sport in Australia. Football, soccer, we've never been as good as England. We've still won a major trophy, a major continental trophy, but England hasn't.
Fair.
I think Warren, who I liked because he was a larrikin, I think he might have died for his jabs, but who knows?
Obviously that's what a lot of people put down to at the time. There's been a rugby league player who's just died of a heart attack at 52 as well, which was the same.
Pretty young.
Yeah.
Pretty young for a fit bloke.
I mean, I'm not a rugby league fan. I'll just look up his name.
I just remember Warnie dying, and I believe there was at least one other Australian cricketer of his generation who were not old dudes.
Andrew Simons, but that was a car accident, if memory serves me correct.
I don't know if it was that one, Furious, but Warnie certainly, all right, he was a larrikin, he used to drink a bit, what have you.
Love to text message to the girls,
yeah, he did, but pretty
this
young,
was before the
the
video phone era.
Exactly.
Hey, look, if I was as famous as Warnie, I might have text messages goals. I don't know, maybe, but yeah, great bowler, really great. One of the best in history. So I don't know.
Well, sorry, Tim. Just quick on the Warren thing. It's one of those things where sometimes what distinguishes a person is how he's considered amongst his peers. And I actually can't remember if it was. I got a feeling it might be Bradman, but a great from a past era, sort of, or might have been Richie Bennett. I can't remember. One of the two. Basically, did a list of. If you could assemble a list of 5 or 6 of the greatest players, right, of cricketing history,
they would be huge gentlemen.
Yeah. But
as
this
well
is
as great cricketers.
Exactly right, and this is the thing. That list comprises of, if memory serves me correct, Sir Garfield Sobers, Viv Richards, obviously, actually it was Richie Bennett because obviously Don Bradman was on that list. Don Bradman. I'm trying to think who the other, and Shane Warne. And this list was compiled in the mid 90s. Warne had only been playing since 1992.
Wouldn't have got in the gentlemanly category.
No,
a great bowler.
But it's amazing that within a short, less than 5 year span in being an international cricketer for Australia, he had actually made that list of the top 5. I think it was Richie Bennett who did the list. And it was basically a case that when he came to the fore, leg spin as an art form was essentially fringe and dead. And just Warnie almost single-handedly revived leg spin as a form of
he was a
bowling attack in the game.
Great bowler, fabulously great bowler.
Absolutely.
I hated him sometimes as a palm, but yeah, he was a fabulously great bowler. But let's remember, you go back to the start of the Ashes series in the 1880s, and the bales were burned by these Melbourne ladies, and then they gave them to the English cricket captain, and one of those Melbourne ladies married the English cricket captain.
Yeah.
So it was always, it was all, as far as I was concerned, anyway. You could get angry about it, but really, it was always like a family battle. In the Ashes series, England, Australia, that's a family battle.
Absolutely.
It's got nothing to do with anyone outside of England and Australia.
Absolutely.
And
But
yeah,
yeah.
it was kind of, even when I was a kid, it was kind of cool. And like I said, my dad got taken to see the Australian batsman play his great innings, which sadly he didn't after World War II. But that was the way I was brought up. It was a family battle,
Yeah.
Big time, very harsh,
yeah.
but family.
But at least, rest assured, Andrew, I'm sure you know where I'm coming with this. Is that coming from with this? Is that I'm sure for all of your, as much as Warney might have rolled you the wrong way when he bowled well against England, I'm sure you won't dislike him more than Mike Gatting does.
Oh yeah, 100%.
You know, the so-called bowl of the century.
I might dislike him less than I dislike Mike Gatting, but that might be just me. So yeah. Absolutely. Like I said, my favorite Ashes tour was when Botham and Brearley was in charge, and the England fast bowler took, I can't remember what it was now, but he got some fabulous figures, and that was my best ever Ashes series. And I was lucky because I sat and watched that with my dad and my brother. And because I wasn't at work at the time, I was able to watch all of it. And it was just so brilliant. But Australia have won loads too. So yeah, we each have our wins.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know. I could talk about as much as I don't watch a lot of sport anymore. God, I could talk about it as a subject. I could talk for hours on end because
cricket is so good. It's like I said, it's somewhere between civilization and war, and only the English could have invented it. And like, to see it at its best, you got to watch an Ashes series between England and Australia, because they're the most guys who understand it from 200 years ago, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about, I mean, I say this as someone who, you could often quote me on, UO, for instance, and I have my pretty deep-seated critiques of the Anglosphere, but that is not to say that I am not a fan of British and English culture. I actually am, and in some ways I'm deeply respectful of it. But one thing I will say in this regard is that, of course, the English invented cricket. There is something so sort of reflective of the English gentlemanly sort of spirit than a game that is played on a grassy field for 5 days between men who almost mock at adversity, and then we'll go to a pub and chuckle about the events of the day amongst each other and talk smack and banter with one another as if nothing ever happened on the pitch of any consequence. I think there's something so remarkable about, you could imagine like Sir Thomas Picton, playing cricket, or, maybe not Wellington, but, like men of that ilk, you could imagine it. Whereas, could you imagine, Kaiser Wilhelm's son being a tennis player? Not really. You know what I mean? Like, it's a bit of a different expression, if you get my meaning.
A cricket ball is so hard that if it hits you wrong, it can kill you. It's
Oh,
like,
yes.
Americans go on about baseball and baseballs are hard and all the rest of it. No, they're not. Cricket balls are hard.
Well, obviously the death of Philip Hughes was absolutely a tragic and a freak accident as well. I think it's certainly hit a lot of Australians and the cricket world hard.
Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it goes to show that even seemingly innocuous forms of sport are dangerous. Like in the end, and take it from someone who's actually been a pugilist, martial arts do obviously have their risks. Like, the probability of head traumas and whatever are profound, especially like if the objective of a fighting match is to like put the other man down, like obviously there's a risk associated with that. And I mean, we've, I mean, not so much in modern times because safety parameters are very safe, but for those who follow me and things I talk about, I'm obviously a massive motorsport fan. And I mean, if you watched motor racing up until like the 80s, motor racing was supremely dangerous. And, you're talking the idea of, like a human, flesh and bones operator being propelled in what is essentially, for all intents and purposes, a propelled motorized weapon, essentially. And doing it competitively like that itself is dangerous. And again, very much coded towards our worldview, shall I say, because it's hierarchy. There's no lying against a stop clock. But, that was dangerous. But yet a game like cricket, which is very, ostensibly gentlemanly and, has its banter and it has its tensions and it has its, whatever. But, it is for all intents and purposes a more relaxed sport, a more sort of laid back sport, one performed at a steadier pace. That, you take a cricket ball in the wrong part of the body, particularly the head. I mean, it can be fatal. People don't realize it.
Furious. Watch a batsman who didn't get out to a fast bowler for, I don't know, 35, 40 overs. Go and look at his body, mate. He'll be black and blue.
Yeah. No.
Even with the protection they give you these days, he will be black and blue.
I listened to a talk given by Matty Hayden and Justin Langer, and for those who follow cricket will know that they led the Australian opening partnership for better part of a decade through the 2000s. Certainly from like maybe 2003, 4 onwards, right? And they sort of did so up until like the early 2010s or just before the 2010s. And they often spoke about just being peppered time and again, and like even like to this point where they still have like little nodules on their elbows, because they just get struck by short delivered, fast bowling from people, like Shoaib Akhtar or I mean, a bit after sort of Courtney Walsh's time. Those really heavy hitting, fast
play
attacks.
Against those guys, man, and not get hit.
No, exactly.
And all right, you got some protection these days, but if you're facing world class fast bowling today, you're going to be black and blue by the end of your innings if you don't get out pretty quickly.
If you want to hear horror stories about that phenomena, which you're right about, Iron Duke, and again, Tim probably knows this with his extensive knowledge, is if you listen to any Australian batter from the 70s, like I'm talking like the Chappell brothers and, like sort of their ilk and era, I mean, I'd say David Hooks, but he's passed away, but, like that sort of era of player, their nightmare was facing the West Indies in like the mid to late 70s and into the early 80s, when they used to rock up to a test match with 5 mainline fast attack bowlers and just, pummel the opposition with pace and with sort of medium, high line deliveries, peppering the torso. I mean, that just was savage, and the Windies were sort of almost unassailable through that time period. They were amazing.
I was
Michael
very
Holding,
proud.
Colin Croft, etc.
I got to say, mate, I was very proud that in the early 2000s, I was able to go to the Gold Coast and watch Lillian Thompson playing beach cricket. And like, I'd watched Lillian Thompson in test matches many years before that. But I was actually able to watch them live. So that was really cool because they were really cool. Tim, what were you? I didn't even realize you were a cricket expert. So what do you think about this?
I'm probably not as good as cricket expert than you, but yeah, the 70s it was the fast bowler era, and it was also when cricketers rightfully became professional with Kerry Packer's World Series cricket.
Mm-hmm.
We've certainly drifted on to another subject now.
Yeah, we've kind of gone away from the Anzacs, haven't we?
It's still, but Tim, I would say it was still Anglo-Australian to a large degree. You know, it is.
Well, you mentioned
the original culture of Australia, anyway. You know,
you mentioned the West Indies, and it's interesting the British colonies where the Anglo imprint cemented itself, and other places it hasn't. So obviously, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, cricket crazy, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and the West Indies, but not in Canada or any of the former Arab or North African colonies of Britain as well. So I think certainly it shows that the British, it still has its imprint, but probably mostly in Australia, given that we also share rugby league and rugby union, and soccer is football's the world game. But I think certainly, as you were saying, it's England and Australia. That's sort of, we've had the most history together. Somebody's writing something down.
I don't know, Tim, but I agree with you. Yeah, England and Australia have a very long history.
So to bring it back to Anzac, there, obviously, sport is like what sportsmen are able to do. It's not just the physical, it's the mental, and also the skill as well. It's incredible, no matter what the sport, whether it's cricket or AFL or football, soccer. It's the warrior aspect of it, but it's still nothing compared to being in a war. I mean, that really, like, death is in sports is, it's very small. There's some who are permanently paralyzed, but not compared to in war as well. But what they do have in common is, particularly sport, is sport has also built national identity and culture. I mean, you arrived in Australia, Iron Duke, when 2000 was this? Were you around for the Sydney Olympics? I mean, that was.
I missed that. I came just after me.
Yeah, that was Australiana fever. The sense of national pride that we put on what was called then the best games ever. Australia, I think, came fourth in the medal tally, again punching above our weight.
Arguably our best performance, would you say, Tim? I think if you look at like pound for pound in terms of population v medals.
And Sydney actually was able to build in a cost-effective manner the stadia facilities. It was a nation-building project. I mean, you look at the mess today of the Brisbane Olympic Games and the cancelled Victorian 2026 Commonwealth Games. And that's another thing about the Australian. I mean, I'm a libertarian. Like, I believe that the free market should provide most things, but nobody can dispute that nation building projects like Snowy Hydro after World War II have also built national identity and culture as well. There's sport, building building physical. I mean, look at the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, so associated with Australia as well. Australia, as I said, Australian culture, identity, it's been shaped over many years. I mean, we were never just a colonial outpost, but Australia's culture has been built over time. I mean, we didn't really have much of a sort of film or a unique music scene until the 60s and 70s as well. So
Tim, did you know that, and I only know this from the Franklin, who's another very good Australian YouTuber, but in 1900, Australia actually had more than 90,000 pianos, which was actually higher than many countries in Europe. And of course, a piano was useless to you unless you could play it. So you have to learn.
I'm talking about unique culture. I mean, Australians have always had been highly skilled, whether it be, we haven't even talked about just how we've taken our farmers, those who tame this land, because it's so hard to grow things in Australia with its climate. It's still in war and peace, our farmers have managed to feed us. There was
very
no
skilled
in World War I and II. I mean, I think I doubt, to my knowledge, Australia has never been subject to rationing like Britain was in World War II.
No. Yeah, the Japanese prepared occupation dollars and all this sort of stuff. But unfortunately, from their point of view, the Australian army stopped them in New Guinea, so they never got to use them. So yeah.
They also in New Guinea, they had to fend off those cannibals who ate Joe Biden's uncle.
Indeed.
Which has caused it's become an I know it's a bit of a beat up, but international incident. But do you also remember Today's Tonight host Naomi Robson was detained in New Guinea because they were going to save this Papuan boy Wawa from being eaten by cannibals?
So it vague memory of this.
Yeah, so it reminded me Joe Biden claiming that his uncle was eaten by the New Guinea cannibals of that.
I've been out with girls who were born in the Australian colony of New Guinea.
It used to be part of Australia, but Whitlam unilaterally just gave it away. And he also said to Suharto, you can take East Timor as well. We don't really care.
I know many people in New Guinea didn't think that was a good plan, but all right, yeah.
And the New Guinea Prime Minister recently addressing the Australian Parliament talked about how, Britain and Australia have given them such lasting legacies.
A lot of money,
Yeah,
which is all corruptly gone to people. Yeah.
that may have been, James
yeah.
Marape is the Prime Minister. But
Tim, is there anything you would like to show? Because you have a brilliant weekly news show, which is one of the best ways of keeping up to date with what's going on in Australia. So would you like to show that, Tim?
Oh, of course. So every Monday at 9 p.m. Australian Eastern Time, I do Tim's News Explosion, which is a summary of the news in mainly Australia, but also visit the UK and the US and wherever else there's been development. And without any type of, you would say, I always try to be as say things objectively. Obviously, I have my bias, but I don't have any standard talking points, conservative talking points, that sort of thing, because you know how I was saying before, like the Sky News people, they are 2GB, they all have the exact same talking points.
Yeah, and I can tell people that Tim does not censor stuff like many people do.
Without trying to get get kicked off of YouTube, but I will bring my takes. I expose hypocrisies, double standards on all sides, but I also try to make it entertaining as well, because you got to have a bit of a laugh at clown world as well, because a lot of the news can be quite blackpilling. Well, I'm a libertarian, so I defend people's right to free speech, and I also am objective. I mean, I don't have an emotional reaction to things. I look at everything rationally. And I'll be back tomorrow night. So a show that I used to do was Trad Tasman Talk, where myself and Dewey Dubois, who runs rightminds.nz, I'll put the link to my YouTube channel in the chat. So we did a weekly show where we shared news from across from our respective nations, how each nation was tracking. We ended it at the end of 2022 because Dewey's got a young family, and he was also they were going into an election year, and he was running for the New Conservative Party, which didn't end with any seats in the parliament. We're both involved in a New Zealand media startup, Reality Check Radio, which because New Zealand, it's just basically left, and left. So Reality Check Radio was born last year, and actually talks about. It's not it certainly doesn't stick to the conservative talking points. It talks about 15-minute cities, that fluoride, mandatory fluoridization, medical tyranny. So it's not afraid to go anywhere. So I do a weekly segment on its breakfast program with Paul Brennan, and you can basically talk about nothing's off limits. So you can really have a really free flowing and uncensored conversation. And Dewey Dubois, he's got his own show called The Dialogue, where he's had some really good guests. He had Martin Sellner on, which got the
oh, cool.
The,
Cool. Mindfulness,
yeah,
excellent. Cool.
what is it, this group called FACT, Fight Against Conspiracy Theories, really upset. He also had the Golden One on, and he's also had a Brian Tamaki, he's the leader of this Pentecostal church, Destiny Church, who he's on a leading a rainbow revolt against all the drag queen story time events and all of the rainbow crossings. Like his church members are painting over them. Yeah, painted over two in New Zealand, and the authorities going after them has been called a hate crime against concrete. So, Reality Check Radio is currently off the air at the moment because they're securing financing for their operations. So, because that's off air at the moment, myself and Dewey Jabor, we're going to be on air. Back on air for a one-off show, Trad Tasman Talk. So that's going to be on the Unshackled YouTube channel, which I'll put the link into the live chat as well. Make sure that you sub to them both. Another Unshackled production is the Report from Tiger Mountain with Richard Wollstonecroft, who runs the Melbourne Underground Film Festival, MUF. So here is reports from Tiger Mountain. He's not afraid of any topic either. So he's always great fun, and he's become a regular on Sam Newman's You Cannot Be Serious podcast, where his nickname is Dick from Muff, pun intended. And of course, our website is theunshackled.net. We're also on Substack as well, since that is another growing free speech community as well. It's interesting now that because there is so much free speech social media with Elon Musk taking over X, and then of course a real viable YouTube alternative in Rumble, and then you've also got Substack, which as far as I know they haven't cancelled anybody. That is why, well, our government, for example, is using the using the e-safety commissioner to go after all the free speech on social media now. Because 5 years ago it was easy for them, for Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to do their dirty work for them. I remember how many, fact checks were under various Facebook posts,
100%.
tweets.
Yeah, 100%. I will be putting Tim's main YouTube link in the chat later on, so you guys will be able to just directly link from there. Furious, anything you wanted to show me?
Not a lot going on at my end. Just I was on Academic Agents Unpopular Opinions last week. We covered, obviously that's when the that tragic and unfortunate stabbing with Mari Emmanuel, the bishop in over in Sydney, occurs. So we sort of, myself and Guard,
Yeah, and apparently the stabbing's not the bad thing; it's the bad stuff on social media. The guy getting stabbed, no one cares about.
That's almost become like a side issue now. The fact that
it
there was a terrorist attack in a church in Sydney. It's about, scrubbing from the internet that it even happened. Well,
yeah, Albanese, what a fabulous example to Australians he is.
We haven't been this embarrassed since the lockdowns of Australia. I mean, he's making Alex Jones and Dan Bongino. The footage of him saying that social media took down memes that put my face on other things. That's actually from January 2023, but somebody's dug that up and reshared it this week. Because it cuts off when the reporter asks, "Have you met with Dan Andrews?" And obviously, he's not the Premier of Victoria anymore. But it's I think that what needs to happen with because what people are replying under various mainstream media articles about, well, various robberies and assaults happening is that this contains violence. I'm going to report to the e-safety commissioner. We need to, like the Scots did with Hamza Yusuf's his hate speech laws, overwhelm the system. Just complain to the e-safety commissioner about every bit of distressing or violent content. Because
Tim, I'm just imagining World War II and World War One diggers talking about Albanese, and like, I don't think it would be printable, to be honest. I don't think you'd be able to print it. What they would say about it.
Yeah.
There would
Many
be
such
so
cases,
many
mind
swear
you.
words. I don't think you'd be able to print it.
Many such cases.
Many such cases,
Actually,
as you rightly say, Furious. Anything
yes.
you wanna share, mate? Like, I know you do a lot of stuff with what's his name? The
Apostolic
excellent,
Majesty.
yeah,
The brain in the jar.
Apostolic
Yeah.
Majesty.
So
Great
yeah, for anyone,
history stuff.
oh, he's excellent. You know, and I think I've said this to you before, Duke, is that, you know, not all the time, but in most instances, you know, whatever sort of group I found myself, you know, with friends, or, you know, even when I was at uni or whatever, sort of, I'm like the history guy, and it's sort of funny that in our circles I've managed to come across someone else who's where I'm not the history guy. There's someone who actually has like a far greater, far-reaching knowledge of history than me, and it is Mr. Apostolic Majesty, who's fabulous at what he does, has a fabulous channel. Is also a very good friend of all of ours, but I consider him a friend myself, and he really is an asset, very much as an asset to our circles. And for those who want should we say, like a perennial or a traditional take on history that is not polluted by modern sensibilities and modern presuppositions, I will recommend you all to the Apostolic Majesty channel. You'll find that we have there's a number of standalone streams, and he's streamed with other characters in our circles. He's streamed with Panama Hat and Semigog, and the others as well.
The most recent one I watched, Furious, was Apostolic Majesty and Hitman talking about Russia, which was really good. Really
indeed.
Good.
And all going well, I'll actually be streaming with Hitman this Sunday. So if you're willing to, please come and watch that. But just before we close up, I just want to touch on, because just the last few chats have come through. Wolfish Nationalist actually brings up a good point about firstly, I never actually thought about them not wanting to show up because it's sort of minority on minority, but that's actually quite an interesting take. And the second thing about Assyrian Christians not being angels, the gangs in Sydney were nearly as bad as the Lebanese gangs. Yeah, that's actually true, and it's indicative of the fact that, even though we have group differences amongst Europeans, we as European men do need to be cognizant of the fact that there are such things as narrow in groups and narrow out groups, and also wider in groups and wider out groups, and no matter where these people are from, outside of the European sphere, shall I say, they are still, to a degree, out groups. And yes, a Christian Assyrian has more in common with us than, say, shall I say, like an Iraqi Muslim or whatever. But nonetheless, these are still out groups who bring their squabbles here, and they are the same kind of communities that take their out group squabbles to London and to Birmingham and to Rotherham, and still bring with them their hostile worldviews and beliefs that are antithetical to European civilization. And we ought to remain cognizant of that all the time and not lose sight of that.
That's also why the Australian government and the e-safety commissioner want to censor the footage, because the lawyer for the e-safety commissioner argued in court that it could inflame tensions, because the reason why they're
exacerbate racial tensions,
it should be taken down because it could inspire more Islamic attacks, or it could inspire Christian reprisal attacks. Because, and we've seen Anthony Albanese has also said that maintaining our social cohesion is the utmost priority. So this is the this is the underlying reason for the censorship. And there's other videos of murders which have or killings that have caused social unrest, which haven't been censored by the safety commissioner. That Northern Territory police officer shooting dead Kunjabai Walker, who was coming at him with a knife. That the Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer, with his knee on George Floyd's neck.
Don't say anything about all the drugs that George Floyd had taken. But yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm just talking in the in
the broad sense.
Absolutely, Tim. I get you, man.
The basic, the established narrative, I should say, those aren't censored because probably the governments they like that there's Aboriginals getting angry at a white police officer and BLM starts a riot against the police.
Yeah, 100%. Quite right on that one. And the other thing is too,
there's social unrest that they do like.
Oh, absolutely. The other thing is that in these sort of post-war sort of foundation,
I would just say, look, if you want to keep up on what's happening in Australia, follow Tim, because basically Tim's got one of the standard Australian, not mainstream media shows that actually tells you the truth of what's going on in Australia. Tim is, as you will have noted, and as he said, a libertarian. But I think he's also a nationalist. So I like Tim's news shows. Been following them for many years. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on in Australia, do go and follow Tim Wilms. Furious, like if you know him, you know him. He's big on military history, pretty big on Roman military history. I've been threatening for ages to do a stream with Furious on Julius Caesar, which I would really like to do because I'm a big fan of Julius Caesar. But yeah, Interdasting videos says I'm drunk. Wish I was, mate, but I'm not. I had a triple heart bypass about 7 or 8 weeks ago. So no, I'm not drunk, mate. Wish I was, but not.
And hence we're all delighted, Iron Duke, that you've come out the other side and you're still punching on. I'm sure I speak for everyone to say that we're thankful you're still here amongst us.
I'm still trying, mate. I'm still trying, but I'm still getting slagged off by idiots like Interdasting videos. But whatever. I mean,
some people may be joking, but just for the comment section, like when you have major internal surgery like that on an organ, particularly on the cardiovascular system, and I say this as someone who's had not my heart's been fine, but I've had like other kind of internal surgeries. It knocks you around for a long time. Like if you're under a long anesthetic and you have like significant internal trauma from surgery, like it does actually take weeks and often months to actually get your mind clear again.
It does. And I have a Chinese doctor lady. Who will not give me any painkillers.
Just be patient with our friend here. and actually, again, Wolfie's nationalist. Yes, we absolutely. Before we call it quits on the stream, Andrew.
Absolutely.
Lady
Schlott. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Lady Schlott, who I think most people will know on here. She's a wife and a mother of 3 kids, and she's not very well, and she's in hospital at the moment.
Yeah,
and I would hope everybody would send her their best and their prayers if they're a Christian. So yeah,
absolutely. Much love and many thoughts to our friend Lady Charlotte.
Yes, she's been a great supporter of me, and I had the pleasure of meeting her in real life at the infamous Kelly J. Keane Let Women Speak rally in Melbourne. She she's an all round star. And also she had another memorable event from last year is when Patricia Carvelis retweeted saying that your lesbianism must have gone down like a Led Zeppelin with a
Oh, amazing.
yeah, so I'm wishing her a full recovery because she is made such great contributions both in her own life but to our movement as well. And she also put her body on the line as well during the COVID lockdowns as well.
She's one of the last great ladies with a capital L. And there are not many of those left. So
Well,
get well soon, Lady Ishla.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Thank you very much to Tim Wilms, and thank you very much to Furious Pernex, my guests.
Pleasure.
I
Thank
will
you.
be putting links up for you guys in the chat shortly. A happy Anzac Day to everybody. Don't let the bastards grind you down, and remember how truly great your ancestors used to be.
And
I'll
we
see
can
you
be again.
Yeah, true, Tim. True. I hope. Anyway, I'll see you next weekend with the next Splendid Isolation stream, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. God bless, and lest we forget.